Hello, I'm Jag, and welcome to my final presentation, Analyzing Network Models and Lag Compensation in Online Gaming. Originally, my project was about comparing the dedicated server model with the peer-to-peer model using Unreal Engine 4. I plan to create a game using UE4 and compare the user experience for both network models. As I researched and learned more about networks throughout the course, I discovered that Unreal Engine 4 doesn't support the P2P model. While I knew that UE4 uses the client-server model, it even says so at the beginning of their documentation on networking. I had the misconception that if a client is acting as a server, that's considered a P2P connection. As I will describe later on, this is not true. Also, as I researched further, I discovered that network models are usually determined by the game engine, developer resources, and even the game genre. It is less interesting to compare network models and is much more educational to discuss the programming methods game developers use to compensate for lag, which ends up being far more effective. So I have changed my project to be about analyzing the different techniques used by game developers to compensate for poor network performance. Here's a list of what I'm going to be going over for this presentation. To start, I'll be going over basic terminology and networking concepts in online gaming, as well as reviewing the main types of network models used in online gaming. For those of you that have been following my project since the midterm update, some of these will be a repeat of what you've already read. However, I will be going over them in greater detail for this presentation. I've also included examples of modern day games as well. Then, I'll be going on to the main concepts of my project, an overview of the latency handling strategies used in general across all games. Next, I'll be going into detail on strategies used in fighting games and then FPS games. Finally, I'll be showcasing the test game I created in UE4, where I successfully implemented a lag compensation technique myself. Let's go over some basic terminology when discussing online gaming. The first concept is ping and lag. The ping is the round-trip time for a packet to travel from the player to the server and back again. On the right is a diagram of the basic cycle of a packet in a game. The player sends state update packets to the server, and the server returns a packet with the master game state. It can be observed that this cycle represents the UDP style of communication, which is common to most games because of its better performance, and so there's no handshaking or verification of packet arrival involved. Lag, also known as latency, is the noticeable delay between a player's actions and server response. What causes lag? The first main cause is the distance between the player and the server. Longer distances result in greater travel times for the packets, which is why faster-paced online games limit players to other clients within the same region. The second reason is the number of hops between the player and the server. The more hops there are, the more routers the packets will have to pass through, which adds extra delay as each router takes some time to process incoming packets. This also increases the chances of packet loss, as one of the routers along the way might drop the packets if a packet queue becomes full. The third cause of lag is rendering, which happens locally. The game engine itself can cause delays if it is not well optimized, because the engine might take too much time to render and have to prioritize rendering the game over reading an incoming packet. Finally, the server tick rate can also be a cause for lag. What is the server tick rate? The server tick rate is the frequency in hertz, the number of times a second, that the server sends out updates to clients, and vice versa. When a server receives packets from clients, it doesn't respond to them immediately. That would be too resource intensive and would clog the network. Instead, it pools all the incoming state updates and responds to them at regular intervals determined by the server tick rate. The server tick rate is determined in code by the programmer, who decides how frequent the server should send out update packets. The client itself is programmed with a tick rate to determine how often the client sends out state updates. Typically, the client and server share the same tick rate, but it's possible to vary them. Naturally, a low frequency would mean that the server has a longer time between each response packet. During this time, the client would read this as lag, a delay in response from the server. A higher tick rate results in a more responsive gaming experience, but can cause strain on the network. As I'll discuss soon, the server tick rate can be limited if a client is acting as a server, as they are on consumer-grade internet and hardware. Here are some of the tick rates for various popular games. Some games, such as Battle Royale games with up to 100 players in a match, will vary the tick rate depending on the number of players currently in the game. They start with a lower tick rate and increase the tick rate as more players get eliminated. Before we move on, it is important to discuss the basics of programming for online networking. Adding online functionality to a game adds layers of complexity that require significant work to overcome. While engines like UE4 have multiplayer built into the engine, and turning on the network functionality actually is as simple as clicking a checkbox, the difficulty comes in trying to synchronize the game state among all players. When a game is running over a network, each computer is running its own simulation of the game world, and assuming it's a client-server model, then there's a master game world that all clients need to synchronize with. The game state information that is sent through packets is sent to each client, updating them on the various changes to objects in the master game world. As a programmer, we have to ensure that we are replicating information about important object interactions in the game to the server. We cannot send updates for every object as that would overload the network. So, there must be careful work done to ensure various relevant objects are updated and overwritten to ensure all clients are seeing the same world on their screen. In Unreal Engine, this is referred to as object replication. Now, let's go over the different types of network models. The dedicated server model is designed around a central developer-controlled server that all clients connect through. The server is typically hosted by a data center, which runs on commercial-grade hardware and network structure. This ensures high performance as both the download and upload bandwidths are large and can support a high volume of users. The high up and down bandwidth also allows for a higher server tick rate. Running on commercial-grade hardware protects against a single point of failure as the server is sturdy and reliable. The dedicated server model ensures that no client has a particular advantage. However, there is an advantage for clients that are closer to the dedicated server compared to those that are further away. This network model also boasts the best network security as it keeps all the client IP addresses hidden behind the dedicated server, since all communication goes through the dedicated server and clients don't communicate directly with each other. Because the host server is trusted, as it's a server run by the developer, it can verify the authenticity of game state packets to prevent cheating. Downside is that it comes at a significant cost to the developers to keep the service running. If they plan on supporting users around the globe, they will need multiple servers at different locations. Many popular games use the dedicated server model, as it is one of the best ways to handle a large player base. This is the only choice for games with a persistent world like MMORPGs. For companies that can afford it, dedicated servers are the best way to support multiplayer games. The client-hosted server model is similar in structure to the dedicated server model, with the exception that one of the clients is selected to play the role of the dedicated server. This model is often mistaken for a peer-to-peer model because the network contains only clients. However, this is not a P2P model. While it can be argued that this is another form of P2P networking, we will discuss the details of a true P2P model on the next slide. A client-hosted server model comes at a low cost for the developers as they do not need to host any dedicated servers. If all players are located close to each other, this model can provide better performance over dedicated servers. This model works very well for groups of players living in remote regions far from the data centers. One major problem with this model is the introduction of host advantage. If one of the clients acts as a host, then the player will experience no networking issues or lag because their version of the game is considered the master world. This means this player gets the most up-to-date account of the game world, while all other clients endure some form of lag, putting them at a significant disadvantage. Hence it's called host advantage. Also, since the host is a client, they would be running on consumer-grade internet and hardware, limiting the server tick rate, while running the risk of high latency and packet loss. This would be amplified if the host was behind a Wi-Fi connection. This model also has security risks because the host can view all the IP addresses of the clients as they all communicate through hosts. Since the host is not trusted, as in the dedicated server model, the game is vulnerable to cheats. The client host may edit the memory values of the game data, and all the other clients would have to accept the host game state. Finally, if a host leaves mid-game, the entire game would have to freeze as a new host is selected. This is called host migration. This creates a high risk of a single point of failure. Most games don't rely on the client-hosted server model as a primary means of multiplayer networking. Instead, games use a hybrid of both the dedicated server model and the client-hosted server model, the latter being used for unranked matches between friends. This is the true peer-to-peer model. The difference here is that all the clients are communicating with every other client at the same time. Packets are flooded out to the network from each client announcing game state changes created from their end, which can be incredibly difficult to synchronize for more than 2 players. Essentially, each client is running a master version of the game world on their machine in some form. This model also comes at a low cost for the developers as well, since there are no dedicated servers. It also allows players in close vicinity to experience a low latency game if they were located in a remote area. This model eliminates the host advantage introduced by the previous model, as no single client is running an authoritative instance of the game. However, one client is selected to be the session host that manages handshaking and invites. One major problem with this network model is that for games with more than 2 players, the user experience is greatly varying. The latency with each client will vary, so if a player gets used to timing their attacks based on the lag for one player, they would have to change their attack timing for another player who would have a different latency. This is a terrible experience for the players, especially for games where timing and reactions are fundamental to the game. As all clients are acting as a host in some form and sending out packets to every other client, this model exposes the IP addresses of each player to everyone in the network. Furthermore, this model can easily be affected by a client with poor hardware or small bandwidth. This model is widely used in the fighting game genre. The P2P model excels at this genre because for games with only 2 players, it delivers the fairest experience as both parties will experience the same latency, and there is no host advantage. Dedicated servers would result in one player experiencing a different latency compared to the other, and in a genre where fairness between each player is critical, the P2P model is ideal. One notable mention is the game For Honor that released in 2017. For Honor is a third-person hack-and-slash fighting game that can have matches of at least 2 or more players. Initially on release, the game used the P2P network model. As it is a fighting game, the developers believed it to be the ideal choice for their game. Unfortunately, there were many complaints at launch from the users about poor network performance. Ultimately, For Honor dropped the P2P model and adopted the dedicated server model soon after, and the user base felt this resulted in a better user experience. I suppose while the P2P model works well in theory, dedicated servers seem to offer the best performance for most users. Now let's move on to the main discussion topic for my project: latency handling strategies. It is important to discuss why anticipating lag and accounting for it is a better strategy than trying to design around a system that expects as low lag as possible. After going through all the different network models, it can be seen that the network model is not a major deciding factor in network performance. In fact, the network model may be dictated by the engine, as is the case for Unreal Engine 4 that strictly uses the client-server model. The network model may also be determined by the budget of the developer or the geographic location of the player base. Even if a developer could finance powerful servers, it is still not possible to entirely eliminate lag, especially when distance is a factor. The best strategy is to design in anticipation of lag. So let's go over the general concepts that games of all genres can use to design around lag. Remember that the goal here is not to eliminate lag or even reduce it. It is to anticipate lag and provide all users with an enjoyable experience in spite of lag. The first strategy is interpolation. This is a relatively simple and almost obvious concept. As mentioned before, server ticks happen within intervals. If the interval is large or widens due to sudden loss in network performance or packet loss, an object moving from one point to another can appear to teleport because of a sudden change in distance. Without interpolation, as you can see in the diagram, the object might appear to stutter or rubber band. The code must be written in such a way that teleportation does not occur, and instead the object should smoothly transition to the new location. As shown in the diagram, the engine will smoothly transition the player character from one location to the next by inserting locations in between. The second strategy is extrapolation, or dead reckoning. Extrapolation is when the client makes a best guess of the next game state based on the current state of the objects in the world. The idea here is to simulate a prediction of where an object or player is going to be given the current state. This simulated game state is saved. If an incoming server update tick is lost or delayed significantly, the predicted state is used in its place, resulting in a smooth user experience. If the prediction is wrong, the server issued game state overwrites the predicted game state. This can result in pop-ins, but as we'll see later, it still ends up with a smoothed over user experience. Next up is the client bypass. This technique involves bypassing the network game states for important events such as kills or deaths on the client side. The state is confirmed once the server sends an update. This gives a lagging player a user experience similar to offline play, as some of their actions will occur immediately without having to wait for the server to execute them. Then we have trusting the client. For some games, it can be useful to give trust to the clients, allowing them to dictate certain object states, such as whether they hit a target or not, and the server will overwrite the server state with the client's object state. There is some danger with this, as it can cause consistency issues or even cheating. I will be going over a research paper that discusses ways to alleviate these problems. Finally, we can design around lag by using visual or audio cues to take attention away from a delayed response. Consider the game StarCraft II that uses a cursor animation to take attention away from the delayed unit reactions to a click. Now that we have seen the general concepts that developers use to combat lag, let's take an in-depth look at how games in the fighting game genre implement these strategies.
What lies ahead?
In the fighting game genre, quick reflexes and perfect timing are critical components of gameplay, even at a casual level, let alone the competitive level. As a result, the genre is highly sensitive to delays caused over the network. Without any implementation to account for lag, the game would be unplayable over the internet. The first method that fighting games have used over many years is the delay-based netcode. The idea is that both players will not proceed onto the next frame until they receive input from the other player. Note that the input is delivered every server tick, but it can be delayed due to lag. An input delay is introduced to allow for waiting for an opponent's input to arrive over the network if there is lag. Here is a video that demonstrates the idea. The amount of input delay is varied according to the amount of lag. Typically, the input delay is not very noticeable and can result in an enjoyable experience, hence it is very widely used, especially in Japan. However, it would seem sluggish compared to offline play. Furthermore, this method can cause fluctuations in the input delay mid-game, which can frustrate players in a game that requires perfect timing. Another problem with delay-based netcode is that the model is not resilient against packet loss. As the system will not proceed to the next frame unless both users' input is received, the game will freeze if there is a packet loss. The stuttering is known to badly affect players as it introduces input eating, a phenomenon where a game freezes in the middle of a player performing a combo, causing their input to go ignored and break them out of a combo. The next method is called Rollback Netcode. Originally created by Tony Cannon in 2007, it is almost identical to delay-based netcode, with the exception that it uses predictive frames to fill in the gaps of any missing packets. The game uses extrapolation to predict a player's game state. If a packet is dropped or significantly delayed, the predicted state is used instead to ensure that the game runs as if there's no lag or hitch. Once the update arrives, if the prediction is right, the game state is maintained. According to the creator Tony Cannon, the predictions are right typically 80% of the time because most moves are committed actions like jumping or punching, which follows through to a predictable state. In the event that the prediction is wrong, the frames are overwritten to the correct state delivered by the update packet. This can result in pop-in or rubber banding, but from the point of view of the players, it means their game experience remains the same. In order to maintain predictive states, the game needs to run multiple instances of the game logic under the hood, and it can come at a severe performance loss. Nonetheless, many fighting game enthusiasts agree that rollback netcode is so effective that all fighting games should implement this model. Moving on, let's take a look at first-person shooters. If there was no lag compensation for first-person shooters, players would have to compensate for lag themselves by leading their shots ahead of their target and assume their bullets will take a certain amount of time to register on the server. This means that if there is significant latency, then the player would have to fire their shot to where they think the opponent is going to be instead of where they see the opponent standing right now. For latencies above 300 milliseconds, this makes the game unplayable as players would have to be psychic to beat the opponents, not experiencing any lag. Let's take a look at a popular FPS game, Overwatch. Overwatch makes a great example because many of the techniques they use are widely used by many other FPSs and has become mainstream in the way they handle lag. The Overwatch devs follow some key principles when developing their netcode. Favor the shooter and responsiveness, or no delay. Using the terminology I introduced earlier, what they mean is that they trust clients and they interpolate or extrapolate to ensure smooth movement and responsiveness. They describe how their client has a lot of player or object simulation built in, and they honor the client when it comes to hit detection. If the client registers a hit in the game state, the server will override the game state for all other clients. This ensures that a client will not have to lead their shots if they are facing lag, creating an enjoyable experience for all players regardless of lag. There is no free lunch though, as by trusting the client for hit registration, they introduce a phenomenon called shot behind wall. This phenomenon occurs when a player that is experiencing significant lag registers a shot on an opponent that is not lagging as much while they are behind cover. This situation arises when a player is running along and then reach a wall that covers them from an opponent. On their screen, they are safely behind cover. However, on the lagging opponent's screen, they are still running towards the cover. The lagging opponent shoots the exposed body of the opponent, and the server acknowledges the hit and then delivers the damage to the poor player that believed that they were hiding safely behind cover. To alleviate this, Overwatch places a limit on how much latency a client can have before the lag compensation is switched off, to deter overly laggy clients from having an advantage. After approximately 250 milliseconds, the system disables lag compensation. A research paper that I'm accompanying this project with covers the concept of shot behind cover in great detail and proposes a solution to this. In the research paper, Enhancing the Experience of Multiplayer Shooter Games via Advanced Lag Compensation, the authors propose a strategy to alleviate the shot behind cover phenomenon by implementing a low-cost ray trace between the two players to verify if the opponent has hidden behind a wall. They describe how their implementation is effective in delivering lag compensation while maintaining fairness. Their experiment looks very promising. Finally, I can show you the work that I've done in Unreal Engine 4 to implement a lag compensation feature myself. For my project, I chose to create a driving game and use the driving game genre to perform my experimentation on. While UE4 has a vehicle controller component pre-built with an assortment of physics functionality, I needed to make sure that I had a full and complete control of all variables to succeed in my experiment. Thus, I had to write code for a vehicle from scratch by implementing my own acceleration, air resistance, rolling resistance, and braking using my own formulas. Overall, I'm very happy with how it turned out, as I feel the car behaves perfectly for my purposes of the experiment. As it is written from scratch, important variables like the velocity, acceleration, and turning angle are open to me to manipulate. This is necessary for implementing prediction later on. Once the car was drivable, I had to enable multiplayer functionality in Unreal to transform my game into an online game. This is a trivial task in UE4 as activating network functionality is as simple as ticking a checkbox. The real difficulty arises in ensuring that both the server and the client are seeing the same events on their screen. In UE4, this means that objects need to be replicated between client and server. As I was instructed not to create a full game, I focused entirely on the car itself and left all other objects in the game world unreplicated. Once I finished up coding the replication for both the client and the server, for the cars and their individual variables like velocity, acceleration, and turning angle, I was able to test the game out in its raw form. In this form, the game is fully playable online with a client-hosted server and client. With no latency, the game runs perfectly fine. However, when lag is introduced along with packet loss, the game becomes unplayable for the client. As can be seen from the video, even a delay of 50 milliseconds results in a stuttering game. There is immense stuttering and delay that makes it impossible to control the car effectively. The car model stutters because it is forced to teleport backwards when the server overwrites its position. When there's delay, the player has to predict movements ahead of time to steer the car in the direction they wish to go. This is the result of a game without lag compensation. I decided to implement the interpolation and extrapolation techniques into the game to alleviate the issues the client faces with lag. This involves smoothly transitioning the car between states to remove the stutter effect produced with lag. To implement extrapolation, I needed the client to produce a simulation of the next state, should a packet be delayed or lost. This involves using a prediction curve to predict the velocity and acceleration of the car given the current game state. The client would use a simulated game state if a server packet did not arrive on time or was lost. I will go into greater detail on this in my written report. The result is a much smoother experience compared to the original. Even with a delay of 1000 milliseconds and a packet loss rate of 10%, the client experiences smooth gameplay and can enjoy the online experience. The game is transformed from an unplayable mess to perfectly passable despite poor network quality. Overall, I am very satisfied with my experiment. I'm glad that I was able to succeed in implementing lag compensation techniques. I went from not knowing how to code networking in Unreal to producing an online racing game with lag compensation. To conclude, I believe that lag compensation should be at the front of any developer's minds when constructing their netcode. It seems that in the modern world today, most games are implementing some form of lag compensation or another. However, based on my research, many are still not. In Japan, which is the leading exporter of fighting games, many Western players complain that Japanese developers have not embraced rollback netcode and insist on using dated delay-based netcode simply because it is easier to implement, and the player base in Japan doesn't complain because they are all in close proximity with each other. This alienates foreign players from joining into their games when a solution already exists that can connect players across great distances and still deliver an acceptable user experience online. In many competitive games, online matchmaking prioritizes connection quality over playing with someone of a similar skill. This can severely limit the player experience if the players are unable to find players of the same skill level that are also in close proximity with them. By coding to facilitate lag, it will expand the radius that users can find players to match with, improving their chances of playing against someone of a similar skill level. Ultimately, it increases player enjoyment of the game. Thank you. I hope you found my presentation helpful.